by ropes attached to these rollers. As the interrogation began, the torturer would slowly turn the handles, pulling the victim's arms and legs in opposite directions. Muscles tore, joints popped, and ligaments snapped. In extreme cases, limbs were stretched so far they dislocated completely, or even tore off. The goal wasn't necessarily death, but unbearable pain that forced confessions, guilty or not. The rack became especially notorious during the Spanish Inquisition, and under England's King Edward I. Even nobles weren't spared from torture. One of the most famous examples is Guy Fawkes, an Englishman involved in the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, a failed attempt to blow up the House of Lords and assassinate King James I to restore a Catholic monarchy. After being captured, Fawkes was believed to have been tortured on the rack. The cruel irony was that confessions gained under such torture were treated as trustworthy in court, despite being extracted under unimaginable agony. The rack wasn't just a machine, it was a brutal message: we will break your body until your words belong to us. Imagine being forced to sit in a chair, not just any chair, but one made entirely of cold, hard iron, covered with hundreds of sharp spikes, stretching from the seat to the backrest and armrests. This was the iron chair, one of the most terrifying torture devices of the medieval world. Victims were strapped down tightly, their skin pressed painfully against the spikes. Some versions even had seats heated from below, slowly roasting the prisoner over time. The pain wasn't quick, it was slow, drawn out, designed to cause maximum suffering. Often, the victim was forced to sit completely still for hours, or even days. Any movement meant the spikes would dig deeper. Staying still brought numb, relentless agony. What made the iron chair especially terrifying was that it was rarely used to kill. Instead, it was a tool of fear, to intimidate, to break a person's will, without much bloodshed. Sometimes, just the sight of the chair was enough to make someone confess before they were even strapped in. The iron chair wasn't just a device, it was a chilling symbol of fear, proving that pain didn't have to be quick to be devastating. At first glance, the pair of anguish looks almost harmless, like a metal flower bud or an iron fruit, but it was a cruel torture device designed to cause extreme internal pain quietly and often without visible marks. This metal pair could be inserted into the mouth, rectum, or vagina, depending on the accused crime, and once inside, a screw would be turned to force the petals to slowly open, tearing delicate tissues from within. This method of torture was mostly used on people accused of heresy, blasphemy, homosexuality, or adultery, especially women when the goal was to shame them. It was done in private to avoid public blood or screams, but the pain and trauma it caused were very real and long-lasting. Of all the medieval torture devices, few were as horrifying and theatrical as the brazen bull. This hollow metal statue, shaped like a full-sized bull and often made of bronze or brass, was designed for one sickening purpose: to roast a person alive. The victim was forced inside through a door in its side, and once sealed, a fire was lit beneath it. As the metal heated, the person inside would slowly burn alive, their screams trapped within the bull's belly. But the cruel twist was in the bull's design: acoustic tubes in its head and mouth transformed the victim's screams into animal-like bellowing sounds, making it seem as if the bull itself was crying out in agony. This was not just torture, it was a twisted performance that turned pain into spectacle and death into entertainment for rulers and crowds. Though most famously linked to Phalaris, a tyrant of ancient Sicily, the brazen bull's legend haunted Europe for centuries. It stands as a dark symbol of how torture was sometimes about dominating the spirit as much as breaking the body. The breaking wheel wasn't hidden away in a dungeon or whispered about in fear, it was a brutal public spectacle meant for entire crowds to witness. Also called the Catherine wheel, it was a large wooden wagon wheel with spokes, to which the condemned was tied, limbs stretched out. Executioners used heavy iron bars or hammers to smash the prisoner's arms and legs, breaking bones one by one between the spokes. The goal wasn't always to kill the victim right away. Often, their bodies were bent into unnatural shapes and left out in public for days as a horrifying warning to others. Sometimes, the broken body was tied to the wheel and hoisted up on a pole to slowly die from exposure and internal bleeding. Used throughout Europe, especially in Germany and France, it was reserved for the worst crimes like murder, treason, or robbery. Sometimes, when the crowd watching the execution felt sympathy or pity for the victim, the executioner would deliver a coup de grace, which means a merciful final blow intended to quickly end the victim's suffering. However, most victims were forced to endure prolonged agony, experiencing intense pain and suffering that could last for hours or even days. The breaking wheel itself was more than just a method of torture, it was designed as a terrifying public display of power, meant to intimidate others by showing the harsh consequences of crime. Unlike the dramatic devices made for crowds, the heretic's fork was small, simple, and deeply sinister. It didn't tear skin or crush bones, instead, it used stillness as its weapon, making even the slightest movement unbearable. The device was a metal rod with sharp prongs on each end, one side rested under the chin, the other pressed against the upper chest or throat, and it was strapped tightly around the victim's neck with leather. The result? The person couldn't nod, look down, or even fall asleep without the spikes piercing their flesh. Often used during the Inquisition on those accused of heresy, hence its name, the fork wasn't meant to kill but to mentally break its victims, forcing them to stay awake for days until they confessed or lost their minds. Some versions even bore engraved Latin phrases like "I renounce," a cruel reminder of what the victim was expected to say. And if the victim fainted from exhaustion, they would wake up impaled. The heretic's fork proves that torture wasn't always noisy or bloody. Sometimes, the pain was silent, and the hardest damage happened inside the mind. Few devices combined humiliation and agony as cruelly as the Judas cradle. At first glance, it looked like a simple wooden pyramid mounted on a stand, but its purpose was horrifying. The victim was stripped naked, their hands and feet bound with ropes, then slowly lowered onto the sharp tip of the pyramid, positioned to pierce the anus or vagina. The descent could be fast or slow, sometimes controlled by pulleys, but either way, the weight of the victim's body did the rest. Over hours, the pointed shape tore deeper and deeper, causing unimaginable internal pain and often fatal infections. But the physical torture was only part of it. This punishment was deeply sexualized and shaming, especially when used on women or those accused of heresy, sodomy, or witchcraft. Victims were often displayed in public, with townspeople watching as their bodies were slowly broken. If they fainted, torturers would lift them off, only to begin again once they regained consciousness. The Judas cradle wasn't just meant to hurt, it was designed to humiliate, destroy a person's dignity, and turn suspicion into a spectacle of suffering. Unlike many medieval torture devices that focused on inflicting physical pain, the scold's bridle was a cruel tool designed primarily for public humiliation and social control, especially targeting women who dared to speak out or challenge authority. This terrifying device was a heavy iron mask that enclosed the entire head, often intricately made but merciless in function. Locked tightly around the wearer's skull, it featured a sharp metal gag or bit that was forced down into the mouth, pressing heavily on the tongue or even the jaw. This gag made speaking impossible, causing intense pain whenever the wearer tried to talk, eat, or even swallow. Women accused of being scolds, a medieval term for those labeled as nags, gossips, or outspoken troublemakers, were condemned to wear the scold's bridle in public spaces. The punishment was not only physical but deeply psychological, to be paraded through town, humiliated and mocked by neighbors and strangers alike. The heavy iron and the biting gag inflicted constant discomfort and pain, while the public spectacle reinforced the harsh message that women's voices were to be controlled and silenced. The scold's bridle was more than just a punishment, it was a symbol of the period's strict social order, where obedience and silence were demanded, especially from women. It illustrated how medieval society viewed speech as a dangerous power that needed to be suppressed to maintain peace and authority. The device combined physical torture with public shaming, making it clear that defiance or dissent would not be tolerated. When you hear about medieval torture, one image often comes to mind: the Iron Maiden, a tall, coffin-like box lined inside with sharp spikes, designed to pierce the victim as the door closed. But did this horrifying device really exist in the Middle Ages, or is it just a dark legend? The Iron Maiden is famous in movies, books, and museums, but historians debate its true origins. Most evidence suggests it was likely invented much later, in the 18th or 19th century, possibly as a sensational exhibit to scare or entertain visitors. Despite dramatic stories, no reliable medieval records mention the Iron Maiden being used as a torture device. Instead, it might be a myth born from the era's fascination with cruelty, a symbol of medieval brutality rather than a real tool. Now that we've explored the most chilling torture devices, it's worth asking, why was torture so extreme in the medieval period? What purpose did it serve beyond simple punishment? And how did such cruelty finally come to an end? Torture wasn't random cruelty, it was deeply connected to religion, control, and fear. The church and ruling powers believed physical suffering could cleanse the soul, punish sin, or force the truth from those accused of crimes or heresy. Most of this torture happened during the Inquisition, when the church punished heretics. Heretics were people who believed different things than the church and were seen as a threat to the church's power and rules. For the church, torture wasn't just punishment, it was seen as a way to save souls by forcing people to confess and repent. Beyond religion, rulers used torture to maintain order and control. Without modern police or prisons, harsh punishment served as a strong deterrent, and a clear reminder of the ruler's power. Fear was central. Public torture and executions sent powerful warnings that rebellion, theft, or disobedience would face merciless consequences. In short, torture wasn't just about causing pain, it was about shaping society, enforcing beliefs, and securing authority. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe began undergoing a profound transformation. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about justice, fairness, and the inherent dignity of human beings, ideas that challenged the brutal traditions of the past. Philosophers and reformers questioned the use of torture, condemning it as both barbaric and ineffective, as confessions extracted under extreme pain were unreliable. Gradually, legal systems started shifting away from fear-based punishment toward principles of evidence, reason, and fair trials. This intellectual revolution influenced rulers and courts to ban torture and seek more humane methods of justice. As torture faded from official practice, it took on a new role, as a haunting symbol of a darker era, a stark reminder of how far society has progressed. This shift laid the foundation for modern legal systems, where the protection of human rights and the rejection of cruelty are central pillars. And that's a wrap on our journey. If you found this video fascinating, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into medieval mysteries and stories from our past. Imagine a world where your job wasn't just hard, it was downright disgusting. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a time when society depended on people doing jobs so foul and revolting that just thinking about them today might make you gag. I'm talking about gong farmers who waded knee-deep in human waste, leech collectors who let bloodsuckers feast on their skin, executioners who not only carried out death sentences but also cleaned up the gruesome aftermath, and many more roles that were essential but utterly repulsive. Could you handle the dirtiest jobs of the medieval world? Stick around, because we're about to uncover the shocking, stomach-churning roles that kept medieval society running, and the people brave enough or desperate enough to do them. Let's dive into one of the absolute dirtiest jobs of the medieval era, the gong farmer. Picture this, crawling down into the deep, dark cesspits hidden beneath the medieval latrines, shoveling out buckets and buckets of human waste. This was no ordinary cleaning job. These brave, or perhaps desperate, individuals faced some of the nastiest conditions imaginable every single day. They had to work in pitch-black tunnels filled with stifling smells, toxic gases, and the constant threat of disease. It was a tough, lonely, and extremely dangerous job. Because of how disgusting their work was, Gong farmers usually did their grim tasks at night, under the cover of darkness. This helped them avoid humiliation and the endless complaints from townsfolk who wanted nothing to do with the foul stench or the sight of someone handling the town's filth. Even though their work was absolutely essential for keeping the town clean and preventing disease, Gong farmers were treated like outcasts, shunned and avoided by most people. But here's a surprising twist: despite the awful nature of their job and their low social status, Gong farmers were actually paid pretty well. Their work was valuable because without them, medieval towns would have been overwhelmed by waste. And get this, what they collected wasn't just thrown away. In many cases, the human waste was carefully collected and reused as fertilizer to enrich fields and gardens. It might sound gross to us now, but back then, every resource mattered. Even something as revolting as human waste was considered useful and precious for growing food. So, while the life of a Gong farmer was harsh and humiliating, their role was absolutely critical to the survival of medieval communities. Now, picture yourself stepping into cold, muddy marshes and swamps, surrounded by thick reeds and murky water. You roll up your sleeves, or maybe your skirt, and brace yourself for a truly unsettling task, letting dozens of slimy, blood-sucking leeches latch onto your skin. This was the grim reality for medieval leech collectors. These brave, or perhaps unlucky, men and women would wade through these wetlands, patiently waiting for the leeches to attach themselves, so they could harvest these creepy creatures for medical use. Leech therapy was hugely popular during the Middle Ages. People believed that these wriggling bloodsuckers could suck out bad blood or excess fluids, which supposedly cured all kinds of ailments, everything from stubborn headaches and fevers to serious infections and even mental illness. While patients might have felt some relief, the leech collectors themselves faced real dangers. Constant exposure to leeches meant frequent blood loss, and many suffered from infections caused by bites. Even worse, some collectors contracted deadly diseases that spread through their work. It was a hazardous job with a disgusting side effect, bleeding from dozens of tiny bites and the constant risk of illness. Most leech collectors came from the lower classes, peasants or poor villagers, or were women, often taking on this grim task simply to survive. Despite the revolting nature of the work and the health risks, their role was vital in a medieval world where bloodletting was considered one of the main routes to good health. Without these collectors, doctors and healers wouldn't have had the leeches they needed to perform their treatments. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most feared and deeply reviled professions in medieval society, the executioner. This wasn't a job for the faint of heart. It wasn't just about swinging an axe or tightening a noose. Executioners were the grim enforcers of justice, carrying out death sentences often in full view of a crowd. Public executions were more than punishment, they were a brutal form of entertainment, drawing villagers, nobles, and curious onlookers alike. The spectacle served as a chilling reminder of the law's power and a warning to those who might dare break it. But the executioner's work went far beyond the final blow. They were responsible for disposing of bodies after the sentence was carried out, often handling the blood and gore that stained their tools and clothing. They also performed torture on condemned prisoners, extracting confessions or punishing the accused before the ultimate sentence. This gruesome trade was frequently passed down from father to son, as few were willing to take on the social stigma and psychological toll that came with the role. Executioners were shunned by many, forced to live on the fringes of society, isolated and feared. Despite the horror of their work and the isolation they endured, executioners sometimes found a dark advantage in their position. Prisoners or their families would often offer bribes or tips to executioners, hoping for a quicker death, or a more merciful end. In a world where justice could be mercilessly harsh, the executioner's favor could be a slim but precious mercy, a chance to avoid prolonged agony or a cruel public spectacle. If you thought the previous jobs were rough, just wait until you hear about the life of a medieval tanner. These were the folks responsible for turning raw animal hides into leather, the essential material behind everything from sturdy armor and durable shoes to belts and even the covers of treasured books. But don't be fooled, the tanning process was far from pleasant. It was a filthy, foul-smelling business that demanded hard, relentless work. To prepare the hides, tanners had to soak them in a potent, and frankly disgusting, mixture of water, urine, and sometimes even dung. This noxious brew was used to loosen the hair and soften the tough skins, making them pliable enough for crafting. The smell that rose from the vats was absolutely overwhelming, a thick, sour stench that could choke anyone downwind. So powerful was this odor that tanneries were often pushed out to the very outskirts of medieval towns, a stinking reminder to keep the foulness far away from the living and the innocent noses of the townsfolk. But here's the fascinating twist: despite the unbearable smell and the tough labor, leather was incredibly valuable. This meant that skilled tanners could actually carve out a decent living from their trade. In fact, some historians suggest that the phrase stinking rich might have its roots in the world of tanning, referring to those tanners who became wealthy, despite, or perhaps even because of, the horrid stench that surrounded their work. It's a perfect example of how even the most repulsive jobs in medieval times could be lucrative for those tough enough to endure them. Let's shift gears to a job that's both iconic and horrifying: the plague doctor. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, these eerie figures clad in long, dark cloaks and strange beaked masks became a grim symbol of both hope and dread. To many, they represented the last line of defense against an invisible, unstoppable killer, but to others, they were a chilling reminder of the terrifying times. Those famous beaked masks were more than just creepy costumes. They were stuffed with aromatic herbs like lavender, rose petals, and even dried mint. At the time, people believed that diseases spread through miasma, or bad air. So, these herbs were thought to filter out the poisonous smells, and by extension, the plague itself. The long cloak, gloves, and wide-brimmed hats were early attempts at protective gear, designed to cover as much skin as possible. But despite looking like something out of a horror story, these hazmat suits offered very little real protection by modern standards. Plague doctors faced a grim and heartbreaking job. Armed with limited medical knowledge, they tried to treat the sick with whatever they could muster: bloodletting to balance the body's humors, herbal concoctions, and endless prayers. They documented symptoms and tried to trace the spread of the disease, but often had little success in stopping it. Tragically, many plague doctors themselves succumbed to the Black Death, becoming part of the very tragedy they fought against. Their haunting image endures as a reminder of a dark chapter in history when fear and desperation shaped every life. Now let's dive into a job that was both absolutely crucial and downright creepy: the rat catcher. In medieval times, rats were far more than just pesky critters. They were a huge menace. These relentless rodents spread deadly diseases like the bubonic plague, ruined precious grain stores, and bred faster than anyone could keep track of. Without someone to control their numbers, entire communities faced real danger. That's where the rat catchers came in. Armed with an odd mix of tools, dogs trained to sniff out and chase rats, a variety of traps, and sometimes even their bare hands, they hunted these sneaky pests wherever they went. From cramped homes and bustling marketplaces to even inside the grand walls of castles, rat catchers were on the front line of keeping medieval life from falling apart. Despite the importance of their work, society largely viewed them as unclean and kept their distance. No one wanted to get too close to someone who dealt daily with filth and disease. But here's a surprising twist: some rat catchers turned their grim work into a form of street entertainment. They would demonstrate their skill by catching rats in front of crowds, showing off their speed, agility, and clever tricks. This mix of pest control and public spectacle made rat catching a bizarre blend of danger and showmanship. If you think working with animal hides or catching rats was bad, just wait until you hear about the grim life of a medieval fuller. Fullers were absolutely essential in the cloth-making world. Their job was to clean, thicken, and prepare wool so it could be turned into warm robes, blankets, and everyday clothing. But how exactly did they do it? Well, here's the shocking part. Fullers had to stomp on heavy pieces of woolen cloth in large tubs filled with stale urine. Yes, you heard that right, urine. Back then, people knew that urine contained ammonia, a natural chemical that acted like a detergent. This magical ingredient helped break down grease, dirt, and oils embedded in the wool. So fullers literally waded barefoot into these smelly vats, stomping and pounding the fabric for hours on end until it was clean and thickened enough for use. The smell was intense and clung to their skin and clothes, making fullers some of the most infamous workers in medieval towns. Their workshops were often located at the edges of villages, avoided by most people because of the overwhelming stench. Despite the foul conditions, fullers played a crucial role. Without their hard, smelly labor, medieval Europe wouldn't have had the fine, sturdy wool cloth that even monks relied on for their simple yet durable robes. Now, let's meet the fascinating world of the barber surgeons, a medieval hybrid of barber, dentist, and surgeon all rolled into one. These multitasking practitioners were the go-to folks for everything from trimming your hair and shaving your beard to pulling your teeth, letting blood, and even performing minor surgeries. Yes, the very same person who gave you a haircut might have been the one to lance an infected wound or try to stop bleeding. Armed with sharp knives, scissors, and other crude tools, barber surgeons worked in an era long before modern hygiene and anesthesia. One of their most common practices was bloodletting, where they applied leeches or made small cuts to draw out bad blood, believed to cure all sorts of illnesses. That iconic red and white striped barber pole you see today actually dates back to this time. The red stripe symbolizes the blood, and the white stripe represents the bandages used to stop the bleeding after a procedure. While barber surgeons were considered lower in status than university-trained physicians, they were absolutely essential, especially in towns and villages where real doctors were scarce. They provided everyday medical care to people who had nowhere else to turn, from fixing a painful tooth to treating wounds from battle or accident. Their work was often gruesome, sometimes dangerous, but always vital for medieval communities. One of the most dreaded and grim jobs in medieval times was that of the gravedigger, especially during plague outbreaks and wars, when death seemed to surround every corner. These workers faced the heartbreaking task of digging mass graves to bury the dead as quickly as possible, all in an urgent effort to stop disease from spreading through towns and cities. The work was not only physically exhausting but emotionally devastating. Imagine digging grave after grave, sometimes burying hundreds of bodies in a single day. Often, gravediggers worked in relentless shifts, barely stopping to rest, as the sheer number of deaths overwhelmed the community's ability to cope. Because they were constantly exposed to death and disease, gravediggers carried a dark reputation. Many saw them as cursed or unlucky, so they were shunned and avoided by others. Despite this social isolation and the emotional toll, their work was absolutely essential. Without them, the risk of infection would have skyrocketed, putting everyone's health in jeopardy. So, why would anyone willingly choose such disgusting, dangerous jobs? The answer boils down to one harsh reality: survival. For countless medieval people, these revolting roles weren't just jobs, they were some of the very few ways to earn a living and put food on the table for their families. Surprisingly, many of these dirty, risky occupations actually paid better than safer, cleaner work. That extra coin wasn't just a bonus, it was often the difference between starvation and survival. When your options were limited, risking filth and danger became a necessity. Most people who took on these grim tasks came from the lowest rungs of society: peasants, outcasts, or even criminals who had nowhere else to turn. Society marginalized them, pushing them into these unappealing roles. And once trapped, it was nearly impossible to climb out. The stigma and social barriers kept them locked in. Add to that the crushing weight of community pressure and the brutal realities of medieval life, and it's clear why choices were so limited. Despite the shame, the grime, and the risks, these essential workers kept medieval towns running. They were the backbone of society, holding the wheels of daily life in motion, even when no one wanted to talk about the jobs they did. Now it's your turn. If you had to choose, which of these jobs would you take on? Could you handle being a gong farmer, a rat catcher, or even a gravedigger? Let me know in the comments below. Imagine this, it's the dead of winter. Snow piles up against the towering stone walls of a grand medieval castle, and the sky hangs low and grey. Inside the great hall, a king sits beside a roaring fire, wrapped in thick furs, but he can still see his own breath clouding the air. His fingers tremble from the cold. Servants hurry to heap more logs onto the fire, yet it barely makes a difference. How can this be? How could a king, surrounded by the wealth and power of a vast kingdom, still shiver in his own castle? These fortresses were built to be impenetrable, designed to withstand sieges and storms. Their walls were thick, their towers high, but when it came to warmth, they failed. Even the noblest lords and ladies, dressed in the finest cloaks and seated by the largest hearths, couldn't escape the bitter chill. Was it poor design? A lack of technology? Or was there something deeper about the nature of these stone giants that doomed them to be freezing cold? Today, we'll uncover the hidden truths about medieval castles, why their towering walls and grand halls were so icy that even kings couldn't keep warm. And the answers might surprise you. The main reason castles were so cold was the stones they were made of. Medieval castles had thick stone walls to protect against attacks and last a long time. But there was a problem: stone doesn't keep heat in. Unlike modern houses that have insulation to trap warmth, stone walls absorbed the cold from outside and sent it inside too. Even with big fires burning, the walls stayed cold. The bigger the castle, the harder it was to keep warm. It's like lighting a fire inside a stone cave. The heat rises and quickly disappears, and the walls stay icy. This is what life was like in a medieval castle, even for the king. The very stones that kept them safe also made them cold and chilly. Castles had another big problem besides the cold stone walls: gaps and drafts. Medieval builders cared more about defense than comfort, so they left many openings in the design. Arrow slits, big chimneys, and heavy wooden doors that didn't fit tightly or let cold air in. Inside, the high ceilings and open spaces made things worse. Warm air from fires would rise up and disappear, leaving the lower parts cold. With so many cracks and openings, chilly winds would whistle through, stealing any heat. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was like living in a windy stone tunnel. Imagine standing in a hallway with a cold breeze always blowing past you. That's what life was like inside these huge stone castles. Even the king's own rooms were cold and drafty. Inside a castle, the rooms were often huge, like great halls with tall, curved ceilings that echoed every step. But warming these big spaces was really hard. The fires were usually small compared to how big the rooms were. A single fireplace in a hall as big as a basketball court couldn't make enough heat to warm the whole area. The heat from the fire would quickly rise up, while the cold stone walls soaked up most of the warmth. Even if servants kept adding logs, the heat only spread a little way from the fire. Sometimes there were several fireplaces, but it still wasn't enough. People would often sit close to the fire with their backs feeling freezing cold and their fronts too hot, while the rest of the room stayed icy like a fridge. That's why kings and nobles often layered up with thick cloaks and furs, indoors. Heating in castles had another big problem besides the size of the rooms and the cold stone walls. Not everyone even had access to the heat. Heating was a luxury mostly reserved for the highest-ranking people. The king and queen might have had a fireplace in their private chambers, but servants, guards, and lower-ranking residents often lived and worked in cold, unheated spaces. Great halls used for feasts and gatherings had large fireplaces to provide some warmth during events, but once the festivities ended, the fires would die down and the rooms quickly returned to their icy state. Servants slept in chilly quarters, relying on heavy blankets or huddling together to stay warm. This shows that warmth wasn't just about survival, it was a status symbol, highlighting how those at the top lived more comfortably while others endured the harsh cold. Castles had yet another major problem when it came to staying warm: windows. Unlike today's homes, medieval castles rarely had glass windows, which made keeping out the cold nearly impossible. Glass was very rare and expensive in the medieval period, so most castle windows were just open spaces covered by wooden shutters. These shutters could be closed during storms, but they did very little to block drafts or cold air from sneaking inside. Even in the king's chambers, where comfort was more of a priority, shutters often left gaps that let chilly winds slip through. Plus, because shutters were opened during the day to let in light, warmth would easily escape, making it even harder to heat the rooms. It wasn't until much later that glass windows became common in castles, helping to protect against the cold. But in the medieval era, windows were little more than wooden flaps standing between people and the biting winter air. Medieval builders did try to warm their castles, despite having very basic technology. One clever method was the hypocaust, an early version of central heating. Hypocausts worked by creating a space beneath floors and walls where hot air and smoke from a fire could flow, warming the stone surfaces above. However, these systems were rare and costly, usually found only in grand bathhouses or the private chambers of wealthy nobles, rather than in the cold halls where most people lived. Even when hypocausts were used, they weren't very efficient and often filled rooms with smoke or created uneven heating. More commonly, people relied on simpler options like braziers, portable metal baskets filled with burning coals. These could be moved around to warm small areas but were far from ideal. For most castle inhabitants, a warm, evenly heated space remained nothing more than a distant dream. Since heating a castle was nearly impossible, people had to find other ways to stay warm, starting with their clothing. Medieval fashion wasn't just about looking good, it was a way to survive the cold. People wore many layers of wool, linen, and fur to trap heat and keep out the chill. The more layers someone wore, the better protected they were from the cold inside the castle. For the wealthy, thick cloaks, fur-lined robes, and long tunics were common. Nobles often kept their cloaks on even indoors, while servants and commoners layered whatever clothes they had. It was normal to sleep fully dressed or under heavy blankets because the rooms were so cold. This layering of clothing was essential for daily life in a freezing castle. Forget light pajamas or comfortable indoor wear, everyone dressed to survive, not to be stylish. And yes, even kings and queens had to bundle up inside their grand but chilly castles. When night fell, the battle against the cold wasn't over, it often became even tougher. Medieval beds were nothing like the warm, cozy places we enjoy today. Without central heating or insulated walls, nights inside a castle could be bitterly cold. To survive, people developed special bedtime rituals. Heavy curtains or tapestries were hung around beds to trap what little heat there was. Beds were stacked high with thick mattresses, woolen blankets, and animal furs, so many layers it felt like being buried under a mountain of warmth. Some castles even used small heated bricks or stones called bed warmers, which were warmed by the fire and placed under the covers before bedtime. These simple tools gave brief relief from the chill, but often the best way to stay warm was by sharing a bed with family or servants, relying on body heat to survive the freezing nights. Castles weren't just freezing, they were often dark, smoky, and downright smelly. While fires were essential for warmth and cooking, they produced thick soot that coated walls and ceilings. The heavy stone absorbed this grime, making it nearly impossible to keep the air fresh. On top of that, sanitation was very basic. Waste disposal was primitive, and garbage often piled up inside the castle or in nearby courtyards. The mix of smells from smoke, sweat, and refuse created a harsh and unpleasant environment, very different from the romantic image we often have of castles today. Living in a castle meant enduring not only the cold but also the unpleasant odors and grime that came with medieval life. Despite their power and grandeur, castles could be uncomfortable and tough places to live. One surprising way medieval people tried to fight the cold in their castles was by covering the stone floors with rushes and straw. These natural materials acted like early carpets, adding a layer of insulation between the freezing stone and bare feet. Rushes, long, grass-like plants, were gathered and spread thickly across floors, often mixed with straw or herbs to improve smell and comfort. This not only helped trap some warmth but also made the castle feel a bit more welcoming and less harsh. Of course, these rushes had to be replaced regularly, especially after being walked on or getting damp. Still, this simple solution was one of the few ways people could soften the cold, hard floors and make life inside a chilly castle a little more bearable. But while castles were drafty and hard to heat, the peasants' cottages weren't exactly cozy either. Peasant homes were usually smaller and made of wood or wattle and daub, a mix of sticks and mud, materials that actually offered better insulation than stone. Their low ceilings helped trap heat, and a single hearth often warmed the entire home. However, these cottages were cramped, smoky, and lacked the strong protection that castles provided. While peasants might have been warmer at times, they faced dangers from harsh weather, wild animals, and attacks that castles were built to defend against. So, both castles and cottages had their own advantages and challenges when it came to comfort and survival in the cold medieval climate. Life was tough no matter where you lived. One major step forward in heating medieval castles was the gradual introduction of chimneys. Before chimneys, smoke from fireplaces filled rooms, making them smoky and uncomfortable, with the air often thick with soot and ash. Chimneys began to appear in castles during the late Middle Ages, slowly improving air quality by directing smoke outside. This innovation allowed for larger, more efficient fireplaces that could warm rooms better without filling them with smoke. However, chimneys were expensive to build and didn't become common until well into the late medieval period. For centuries before that, people had to endure smoky, cold rooms. The rise of chimneys marked a slow but important improvement that made castles more livable over time. Despite the cold, castles were still considered a huge step up from most medieval homes. For many people, living in a castle meant protection from invaders, safety during wars, and the chance to live with a certain status. Even if they were freezing inside, castles offered shelter that simple wooden huts or thatched cottages couldn't provide. Castles were built to last, made from strong stone that could resist fire and attacks. They had access to fresh water, food stores, and often a courtyard where herbs and vegetables were grown. The thick walls kept out wild animals and bandits, giving their inhabitants a rare sense of security in medieval times. So, while castles might have been cold, drafty, and uncomfortable, they were still powerful symbols of safety and strength. In a time when survival was never guaranteed, that was a huge advantage. Interestingly, the coldness of castles wasn't just a drawback, it also had a strong psychological impact. Living in a drafty, chilly stone fortress sent a clear message: power and authority were more important than comfort. The harsh environment constantly reminded everyone inside who was in control. For kings and nobles, enduring the cold was a way to show their strength and resilience. It set them apart from common folk, who lived in simpler, warmer homes. The cold stone walls and echoing halls created an atmosphere of awe and intimidation. In this way, the chill inside castles became a symbol of dominance, reminding both visitors and residents that survival and power mattered more than comfort. The very discomfort of the environment helped reinforce the strict social hierarchy of the medieval world. So, why were medieval castles so freezing cold, even for kings and queens? The answer lies in their design, built for defense and power, not comfort. Thick stone walls, huge drafty rooms, and limited heating options made warmth a rare luxury. Yet despite the cold and discomfort, castles remain awe-inspiring symbols of medieval strength and authority. They were safe havens in a dangerous world, built to protect and impress. The freezing cold inside these grand fortresses reminds us that even the mighty faced daily struggles, showing a different side of medieval life, one where survival meant enduring harsh realities, not just living in glory. Understanding why castles were so cold helps us appreciate the real challenges of medieval life beyond the tales of knights and royalty. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the chilly halls of history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more fascinating medieval mysteries and stories. Imagine you are sick and realizing that the cure could be worse than the disease itself. Instead of clean instruments or gentle care, your doctor approaches with sharp knives, burning herbs, and a jar full of wriggling leeches. In the medieval world, medicine wasn't just primitive, it was downright dangerous. Bloodletting was the go-to treatment, but it often drained more than just bad humors. Herbal remedies could be poisonous, and surgeons operated without anesthesia or sterilization. Even a simple fever might land you in the hands of a barber surgeon or plague doctor, whose treatments were as frightening as they were uncertain. Would you survive medieval medicine? Could you endure cures that were more likely to kill than to heal? Stick around as we uncover the shocking, grim, and sometimes absurd medical practices of the Middle Ages. You'll never look at a doctor's visit the same way again. To truly understand why medieval medicine was so dangerous, we have to dive into the beliefs that shaped it. Doctors in the Middle Ages were convinced that the human body was controlled by 4 vital humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each of these humors was thought to be connected not only to specific parts of the body but also to different personality traits and emotional states. When someone became sick, the prevailing idea was that their humors had become unbalanced in some way. For instance, if you had too much blood, you were considered sanguine, someone who was cheerful and energetic but also prone to fevers and flushes. On the other hand, an excess of black bile labeled you melancholic, which meant you were sad, sluggish, and gloomy. Similarly, too much yellow bile was linked to anger and irritability, while too much phlegm was associated with calmness but also lethargy and dullness. This theory of the 4 humors was the foundation of medieval medical thought, and it guided every diagnosis and treatment. Doctors tried to fix these imbalances using a variety of harsh and often harmful methods. Bloodletting was one of the most common treatments. They would drain a patient's blood with knives, leeches, or lancets, believing this would remove the excess blood causing illness. Purging and forced vomiting were also used to expel unwanted humors from the body. Unfortunately, instead of helping, these treatments often left patients weaker and more vulnerable to infections or other complications. Meanwhile, the actual causes of sickness, bacteria, viruses, poor hygiene, and contaminated water, were completely misunderstood or ignored. Now, let's dive into the notorious practice of bloodletting, often hailed as a universal cure, but in reality, it might have been far deadlier than the illnesses it aimed to treat. Medieval doctors were convinced that an excess of blood in the body caused sickness, so their solution was to literally bleed the patient to restore the delicate balance of the humors. To do this, physicians used a variety of tools and techniques. They would carefully, or sometimes not so carefully, slice open veins with sharp knives or lancets, allowing blood to flow freely. Leeches were also commonly employed, attaching themselves to the skin and sucking out blood slowly but steadily. Another popular method was cupping, where heated glass or metal cups were placed on the skin to create a vacuum, drawing blood to the surface or even pulling it out through small incisions. While these methods might sound brutal, doctors truly believed they were healing their patients. Unfortunately, bloodletting often had the opposite effect. Instead of curing disease, it weakened the patient by draining them of vital fluids, leaving them dehydrated and more vulnerable to infections. Many patients did not die from the original illness but succumbed to the dangerous consequences of excessive blood loss. Despite its risks and the harm it caused, bloodletting persisted as a common treatment for centuries. It was used for everything from headaches and fevers to mental health conditions, all based on the belief that draining the blood would somehow drain the sickness out of the body. This cruel irony shows just how desperate and misguided medieval medicine could be in its attempts to heal. Now, let's meet one of the most infamous healers of the medieval world, the humble leech. These wriggling creatures were more than just creepy crawlies. They were considered vital medical tools in the attempt to cure illness. Doctors believed that leeches could cleanse the blood and restore the balance of the humors that were thought to govern health. The concept was straightforward: attach a leech to the patient's skin, let it suck out the bad blood, and supposedly, the sickness would vanish. In practice, patients would have multiple leeches placed on various parts of their body, often enduring long, uncomfortable sessions. Medieval illustrations frequently depict patients with numerous leeches latched onto their skin, an unsettling sight that was considered a necessary part of healing. However, this treatment was far from harmless. Many patients lost too much blood, leading to weakness or fainting spells. Worse still, the leech bites could easily become infected, causing additional complications and prolonged suffering. These wounds sometimes left permanent scars, serving as a grim reminder of the ordeal. Despite the gruesome history, here's a surprising twist: leeches have not been entirely retired from medicine. Today, modern doctors use medicinal leeches in very specific and controlled ways, particularly in reconstructive surgeries where they help restore blood flow to damaged tissues. It's fascinating to think that these little bloodsuckers, once feared and dreaded, have made a remarkable comeback in the medical world, albeit for very different reasons than medieval healers ever imagined. In medieval times, barbers were more than just haircutters. They were the go-to medical practitioners for everything from haircuts to leg amputations. Barber surgeons performed a range of tasks: pulling teeth, setting broken bones, stitching wounds, and conducting bloodletting, all using the same set of tools they used for trimming hair. Their toolkits included razors, scissors, and crude surgical instruments, but there was no concept of sterilization or anesthesia. Patients had to rely on the barber's steady hand and hope they could endure the pain without screaming too loudly. The iconic red and white barber pole still seen today is a vivid reminder of this bloody past. The red color represents blood, the white symbolizes the bandages used after procedures, and the pole itself is thought to represent the staff that patients grip tightly during painful treatments. What might seem like a simple barber's symbol actually carries the history of a profession that straddled the line between grooming and surgery in a time before modern medicine. In an age before modern medicine, herbs were the mainstay of healing, but were they truly cures, or hidden dangers? Plants like mandrake, hemlock, and foxglove were common ingredients in medieval remedies. Mandrake was believed to ease pain and induce sleep, yet its root was so toxic that it could easily cause death. Hemlock, known as a deadly poison, was sometimes used in tiny doses as a sedative, while foxglove contained digitalis, a powerful heart medicine, but also a dangerous toxin if misused. Most of these treatments weren't grounded in science but were based on trial and error, folklore, and superstition. The line between cure and poison was razor thin, and a remedy could just as easily bring relief as it could hasten death. It's a chilling reminder to wonder whether medieval healers were truly helping their patients, or unintentionally pushing them closer to the grave. When the Black Death swept through medieval Europe, panic spread faster than the plague itself, and with it came some of the most bizarre and desperate treatments imaginable. Plague doctors donned their infamous beaked masks, stuffing the long noses with strong-smelling herbs, convinced that these scents could ward off the deadly disease. They burned fires indoors to purify the air, hoping to cleanse the foul miasma thought to carry illness. But did any of it really work? Many remedies were not only useless but downright dangerous. Patients were given mercury to drink, a toxic metal that often caused more harm than good. Others were smeared with poultices made from strange and foul ingredients like onions, butter, and even pigeon droppings, all in the desperate hope of drawing out the bad air and curing the sick. The iconic plague masks, while striking in appearance, offered little real protection. The beak may have helped mask the stench, but it did nothing to stop the fleas and bacteria that actually spread the plague. Medieval medicine, more often than not, made this terrifying disease even worse. Yet, in the face of overwhelming fear and death, people clung to any hope, no matter how strange or grim the remedy. Imagine being strapped to a wooden table while a surgeon saws into your flesh, no anesthesia, no painkillers, just raw, unbearable agony. Medieval surgeons performed brutal amputations, extracted arrowheads, and even drilled holes into skulls in a procedure known as trepanation, all while the patient remained fully conscious. Their tools were crude and unsterilized, bloodied rags and saws littered the workspace, and there was no understanding of infection control. Many patients didn't die from their original wounds but from shock, massive blood loss, or deadly infections that festered in untreated wounds. Often, these surgeons were barbers or blacksmiths by trade, using whatever makeshift instruments they could find. Clean hands, antiseptics, or disinfectants were unheard of, turning surgery into a desperate gamble. For most, undergoing medieval surgery was a last resort, and too often, it was a death sentence. In medieval times, healing was often entrusted to monks and priests, as medicine and religion were deeply intertwined. Disease wasn't viewed simply as a physical ailment but was considered a punishment from God for sins committed. Because of this belief, the primary treatment focused on prayer, fasting, and confession, with medical care often taking a backseat to spiritual healing. Monks might apply simple herbal remedies, but their work was always accompanied by prayer, seeking divine intervention. At times, the Church even banned human dissection and discouraged scientific study, fearing it interfered with God's will. This close connection between faith and medicine meant that medical progress was slow and often painful for those who suffered, caught between hope for divine mercy and limited earthly remedies. In medieval medicine, diagnosing illness often involved some truly bizarre methods, one of the most common being the examination of a patient's urine. Physicians would hold up vials of the yellowish liquid to the light, scrutinizing its color and clarity, sniffing it carefully, and, shockingly, even tasting it to check for sweetness, believing this strange ritual could reveal the state of a person's health. While the idea of sampling urine sounds downright disgusting to us today, it was regarded as a serious diagnostic technique back then. Yet, despite these efforts, many diagnoses were little more than wild guesses based on what doctors could see or smell. With no scientific tests or microscopes, their methods often bordered on superstition, and unfortunately, this guesswork sometimes made patients' conditions worse instead of better. In medieval times, many women were the true healers of their communities, often called the wise women. These healers carried precious knowledge passed down through generations, using herbs, plants, and folk remedies to treat common illnesses. They skillfully healed wounds, eased pain, and even assisted in childbirth, serving as vital caregivers in a world with limited medical options. But this power came at a price. The church and ruling authorities, suspicious and fearful, often accused these women of witchcraft, blaming them for misfortunes and casting them into dark trials. What began as healing hands too often ended in persecution, as many innocent women suffered simply because their knowledge was misunderstood or feared. In medieval times, the idea of hygiene was vastly different from what we understand today. Doctors rarely washed their hands before treating patients, often moving from one sick person to another with little regard for cleanliness. Instruments were reused without cleaning, and bandages were shared between patients, spreading infections. Public baths were common but often filthy and overcrowded, doing little to prevent disease. Instead of understanding germs, people believed that bad smells, known as miasma, were the true cause of illness. This misconception not only rendered medieval medicine ineffective but often made it deadly, as infections and contagions spread unchecked through unsanitary practices. In medieval times, the concept of germs, the tiny bacteria and viruses responsible for diseases, was completely unknown. Instead, people believed that illnesses were caused by miasma, a dangerous, foul-smelling air that hung around swamps, garbage heaps, or decaying matter. They also attributed sickness to supernatural forces such as curses, demons, or divine punishment. Because of these beliefs, there was little focus on cleanliness or hygiene to prevent disease. Public health systems as we know them today simply didn't exist. Waste, human and animal, was routinely dumped in the streets, open gutters, and rivers that often served as the main water source for communities. This led to contaminated drinking water and unsanitary living conditions, creating the perfect breeding ground for illnesses like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid to spread rapidly. Sewage ran openly through towns, mixing with garbage and rotting food, filling the air with the very miasma they feared. Since no one understood the true cause of disease, efforts to stop outbreaks were misguided at best and harmful at worst. People wore charms or amulets, burned incense, or avoided bad smells, thinking these would protect them. Entire cities could be devastated by plagues and epidemics because the real culprits, microscopic pathogens, were invisible and misunderstood. This profound lack of scientific knowledge meant that medieval societies were trapped in a cycle of repeated outbreaks, with no effective tools to fight back. It wasn't until centuries later, with the discoveries of microbiology and sanitation, that humanity finally began to understand and control the spread of disease. Today, we often think medieval medicine was all cruel and useless, but the truth is more complicated. While many treatments were harmful or based on superstition, some herbal remedies actually had real benefits. Plants like willow bark, for example, contain compounds similar to modern aspirin. Medieval doctors also developed basic surgical techniques and understood wound care better than you might expect. However, the majority of treatments still lacked scientific proof and sometimes did more harm than good. So, medieval medicine wasn't all bad, but it was often a dangerous mix of guesswork, hope, and tradition. And that's a wrap for our journey. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, don't forget to like and subscribe for more fascinating stories from medieval history.